To the session on Friday, 27th of November, to our first Congress of the Campus I Summit and Creative Commons. Our first session this morning would be dealing with knowledge management in the university world. Our moderator is Dr. Roberto Beltran, Director of Campus IOHE, and Hélene LAMICQ, Professor and Honorary Professor of the University of Paris, and member of the Observatory of the University of Magna Carta, the Rector of the Melendez Pelayo's University of Spain, Jose Luis Pio, from the University of Spain, and Jimenez, of the Latin American University of Panama. Welcome, and I'd like to give the floor to the moderator. Good morning. Thank you for being here again in this second and last day of the Congress. Yesterday, at the end of yesterday, we were discussing that Professor Hélene LAMICQ gave up her space yesterday so that Francisco Cervantes of UNAM could give his talk. So she's with us here now in this session 5 about knowledge management in the university world. And we have incorporated at the same time, this is replacing what Dr. Luis Miguel Romero, the Rector of UTPL, was going to do. He will speak in next session, session 6. As is customary in this meeting, each of our speakers will have 20 minutes for the presentation, and then at the end of all the presentations, we'll read the questions that the audience has submitted, and the audience who's watching us over internet will also be able to ask questions. So we'll welcome Professor Hélene LAMICQ, who was training in urban studies in the Paris University of the Sorbonne, and worked on economic planning in developed countries. Her PhD focused on urban geography of Chile, and she has another doctorate in urban studies in Brazil. She also is the rector of the Paris 12 University and was a member of the board of the Association of European Universities, and with the treasurer, and also of the board for strategic management of universities, and is currently the member of the council of directors of the Observatory of the University Magna Carta. Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the committee and the most excellent rector, and also I'd like to apologize for my Spanish, which leaves much to be desired, so both orally and in writing. I would also like to, and above all, express my happiness, my interest, my encouragement in taking part in a discussion about the creation of a common space for higher education, because today I'm beginning with the end of yesterday's session. This creation is very motivating for me. In Latin America, which I got to know, I won't tell you how many decades ago, so compartmentalized, not to say so opposing or divided. So it's a privilege for me to try to take part in this discussion, talking about the construction of another common space for higher education in Europe. The Bologna process that we're going to talk about is not in any way an example, much less a model, for any other common higher education space. It has to be considered, the way I see it, as a sui generis unique process that appears in a very specific context, as we're going to see, and from which certain lessons learned can be extracted to reflections that may be useful to other contexts. So let's look. First of all, let's see what the process of Bologna is, how it was configured. What is our current situation now in this higher education space in Europe, and some reflections by a European about the European process. Before beginning, I'd like to say that my presentation will be somewhat personal. I took part in this process from the very outset, and you'll see that there were several beginnings. But I was the rector in Paris when this process began, the intergovernmental process of Bologna. And at the same time, I was a member of the steering committee for the European Association of Rectors. So on the national and on the international side, the European side, I took part in this process. And after that, I had to go to the ministry. So I had the opportunity, I wouldn't say to act, but to participate from the ministry side. And always participating in the program for institutional evaluation of the European Association of Rectors. I continued to evaluate European universities throughout the period of the implementation of the Bologna process. So what I'm presenting is not an official standpoint. It's the analysis by Hélene LAMICQ about the Bologna process for a Latin American audience. It's important, I think, to make it very clear that that's the standpoint from which I'm going to be speaking. So what is the Bologna process? In a few words, it's a process of harmonization of the level of diplomas in Europe. Europe doesn't mean the European Union, because from the very beginning, the concept of Europe was broader than the countries of the European Union. This process was, how shall I say, it has as the objective, it aimed to build a European space for higher education. And also, the purpose of this process, which we often lose sight of when we present the Bologna process, was the employability of students. I'll get back to that. This process consisted of underscoring 3 levels of degrees. The first degree, the master's, and the doctorate, bachelor's, master's, and doctorate, to be considered as equivalent in the common higher education space. We didn't eliminate diplomas, national diplomas that exist, but we only underscore, that was the initial idea, the equivalent levels of education. These diplomas can be acquired in different parts of the European space of higher education through a system of capitalizable credits, validating the competencies acquired by each student. Validating competencies, which is a key word. These competencies include the hours of courses and classes and personal work by the student. So, the Bologna process basically is this. It's a process. This is going to be a leitmotif that I will repeat throughout this. It's a multi-stakeholder process. It's an intergovernmental process. Here it's not properly written, but it's doing the best I can between Spanish and Portuguese. And this process is being accompanied by a group of representatives of some of the other stakeholders. In a few words, in a nutshell, this is the Bologna process. And we're going to see some dates for this unification of the European space, who the stakeholders were, how the process was managed, and the main lines of action. The process fits into a context of the political integration of the European Union. It goes beyond these boundaries. I said that there were several beginnings, several starting dates. In 1987, the European Commission created the Erasmus program and the system for transferring European credit transfer system to develop university mobility and university recognition. The credit system is now banal. In 1987, there was a it's nothing to write home about now, but it was a cultural revolution at that time, because this meant simply that any scholar has to accept that a physics course or medieval history can be as good as his own or her own. That is, for a professor, this is hard to swallow. But credits, and above all, the credit transfer system, was the single currency to quantify student mobility. Since the Erasmus program was a program of student mobility to make possible to support student mobility from one university to another, from one country to another, for 1 or 2 semesters. In 1998-99, there was a new push that we considered as the official, actual beginning of the Sorbonne, strictly speaking, the intergovernmental process that began with an initiative by ministers. So I'll get back to this as well. Then the number of signatory countries continued to grow in this Bologna Declaration, adopting the same prospects: employability, readability of this diploma system, compatibility of credits and diplomas, and capitalization. In the year 2001, in Berlin, there was a major step forward with the adoption of the main action guidelines, just 2 years after the Declaration of Bologna. And currently, some 50 countries have signed, identifying the elements of the process to be implemented. And I am always stressing this. This process, of course, spread beyond the boundaries of the European Union. These were dates. Who were the stakeholders? Here I've listed a series of stakeholders. This is not exhaustive, nor but chronologically or hierarchically ranked. But the European Commission acted especially at the beginning, because by funding the student mobility program and organizing student mobility, this European Commission gave the first kickoff to dialogues among scholars, because since they were sending students from one university to another, the professors had to talk to each other, discussing the conditions in which students would be able to spend 6 months or a year in some other university. That is, what is your course like in the second year of the BA program? Mine is like this: the recognition of the other and outsiders as equivalent, somebody as a peer with the same standards. So academicians worked for these exchanges and created in one part of the European University, nuclei, to handle the European exchanges. Then, in universities, national governments got involved in 1998 in a way that could seem anecdotal, but I'll tell you why, to show you how sometimes there are key moments to begin a process. For a long time, it had been discussed in universities with certain governments, this possibility of harmonizing diplomas. It happens that there was a short period of several months during which the French minister, the Italian minister, the German minister, and the English minister were more or less with the same political leanings. And our French minister, who was and still is, but he's no longer the minister, a strong character. He appeared one day in the Conference of Rectors of France, telling us, you are going to organize a European conference in the Sorbonne. This year is the 800th anniversary of the Sorbonne. It wasn't, but he said that. The historians disagree. But we're going to celebrate this. We're going to organize the conference, and I will invite 3 ministers. In less than 3 months, this process was totally true. Because if the conference had been a failure, it would have been the rector's fault. And if the conference was a success, it was the minister's success, of course. And it was completely true because they couldn't take the political risk of a ministry failing for this initiative. So, in this famous conference, which was quite busy and interesting, the 4 ministers decided to invite the other ministers of Europe to the next year in Boulogne. Of course, it didn't come out of some 4 ministers' heads just like that. The foundation, the substrate of all of this process had already been prepared by other stakeholders, including the role of universities and the leaders of universities. Through the European presentation, which had configured the single representation, because the universities, we were thinking that it was important to talk with a single voice. For other contexts, this may be somewhat valid. For your case, not my business, but maybe. And through national conferences of rectors, doing lobbying with their own governments, each in their own country, and also at the level of each university, doing ongoing and tiring, exhausting education for the resistance among scholars and students who, because they're young, they say, they're always ready to make changes. There were years of, I wouldn't say of hard work, of leg work. Sometimes we worked like bees, like ants. Sometimes it was a very public activity. And the students, through their European representatives, here it says ESIB because during the time of that, the European Students Association was called ESIB, through their national positions, favoring or against the process, and above all, through their personal strategies for studying and for mobility. Students adapted very quickly to the mobility process. They took advantage of it. They handled it very well. both within the Erasmus program and other existing programs, and as independent travelers without any institutional support. 5 minutes. How does the Bologna process work? It has meetings every 2 years. Every country goes along at its own pace. This generates serious problems. And the main lines of action are the adoption of a system of diplomas that are easy to read and comparable, a 2-cycle system plus doctoral studies, the generalization of the credit system promoting mobility, promoting European cooperation regarding quality assurance. This is an interesting point because at the beginning, quality assurance appeared in the Bologna Declaration in one single phrase only one phrase. But when we implemented the process, we saw that increasingly there had to be trust in the partners, the partner universities. So, the quality assurance issue became an issue that is now a key issue in the European space, promoting the European dimension of higher education, developing ongoing lifelong education, because the matchup of the levels of diplomas makes it easier for the sequence of studies. That you can stop at the BA and resume with a master's after some time, and then also after a while take the PhD. Promoting the appeals, the attractions of the European space, and cooperation at the doctorate level in coordination with the Lisbon process, which is the equivalent of the Bologna process, but for the research aspects. Now, where are we? Where do we stand in the Bologna process? There were quick, strong effects regarding the governmental decisions. But now we see that only part of the countries have actually implemented the system that the government signed. So now we're in a situation of convergence with profound heterogeneity between one national system and another. What is not heterogeneous and is converging is the level of the diplomas. Doctorates has always been considered as equivalent. Levels of master's programs has been harmonized, I would say, fairly readily. But the level of the first degree, the bachelor's degrees, with the differences among countries that already had 2 cycles of studies and those that had graduation and postgraduate, they had the Humboldtian system of single discipline programs of study. This was more complicated. Basically, the leaders of higher education, rectors, institutional leadership, supported the process very much. The vision of employers is very well viewed by employers. The European associations of employers played an important role because when we were in the CRE in 1997-98, we had a number of meetings with employers' associations who opened our eyes and insisted that it was no longer possible to be based on a diploma to hire somebody because you couldn't understand anything about the national diploma systems. These discussions were very important for this idea of underlining equivalent levels. At the level of university institutions, it was verified that acceptance in most countries is greater than the speed, the rate of implementation at the intergovernmental level. The European framework has also been very intensely accentuated. Now we have almost 2 million diploma holders and students who had pieces of diplomas that they had acquired in other universities. And I would say that the students and ex-students, alumni, are the best ambassadors for the European higher education system. That they will tell you that and have known this far before the academicians. The scholars were dealing with this more in research, but now we're talking about teaching and learning. It's been much faster among students. I would say that in general the readability of the higher education system became an actual concern. It used to be something that nobody could discuss. Now, readability is not argued about. We only discuss the modalities. Some reflections now. One is, this is a process. And when I say it's a process, this means it's a multi-decade process. So, the process and the outcome are both interesting. I think this is something that is transferable to other worlds outside of Europe. In a process, there are stakeholders. How shall I say this? There is a longevity of determination that certain stakeholders must maintain. Who are those stakeholders that can maintain this tenacity in a long term? It's certainly not the politicians. Definitely, it's not the politicians, because in democracy, they're elected and they have a certain turnover. So they can deal with this once it's been signed. But what are the forces that are determining forces to maintain the tenacity? They're the universities, university institutions, their representatives through ongoing discussions, insisting on the need for this higher education space and proposing solutions and next steps. We are living the convergence with heterogeneity, because certain governments haven't changed their legislation yet. That is, they remain with their national system. I would like to insist on the fact that the European Union, higher education and research are national competencies. They're not the union's jurisdiction, so they cannot legislate about this. This is an in-country jurisdiction. Since we don't have European legislation, we have only guidelines. And you can't have a guideline in this area because these are national jurisdiction, national competency. It's a process totally for governments to join in adhesion and action by national governments. Some governments have already acted quickly, with or without opposition, by decree. Other governments haven't implemented anything. And there are forces within the countries that are pushing to get this process moving. Other processes, other governments have tried to apply and have taken steps forward and then backward. Your higher education is now a motley coat with a patchwork coat of many colors. It is works for the students, but it's a process that will have to improve. And I think the key issue is that it's converging, and it was not before. Now we had the little parts that were not converging. There are repercussions regarding different sectors. As a reflection, there are sectors that are more resistant than others to change. the resistances have been expressed through the academic and scholarly bodies and associations, or through labor unions, or through the famous idea according to which you can't train a physician, an architect, or an engineer, or a jurist, these are not accidental examples, in 3 years, which is absolutely true. But the process has triggered for students the possibility of thematic mobility after 3 years of undergraduate study. I saw last year, with all of the candidacies for masters in my area, we see already that among the master's candidates, the thematic mobility and geographical mobility now appears in the curricula in most, I would say more than 2/3 of the students who are working for the masters. The effect has been very positive. The two-way movement imposes that each institution has to have a strategy. Institutional autonomy is one key for this convergence process to become a reality quickly. We can go back to this one. And now we'll go quickly to the need for evaluation processes, since universities that we're working with have to have a quality guarantee. And in Europe we have some problems with some areas, but it seems to me that if we begin thinking about other contexts, this quality gap is one of the problems that we would have to discuss in depth, because it could be deadly to the process if there is mistrust or betrayal by certain institutions. So, we would have to think about progressive circles of adhesion, of joining in a common higher education space. Not Dante's circles, of course. These are a virtuous cycle. But it seems to me that it may be that in other contexts, the idea will be to look at the first quality circle in order to drive the others bit by bit in this common space of recommendations. My last slide for more information, there is nothing appears. Here it comes. The websites for more information. The last word. I would like to say it this way. The process began with the decision by a minority of the stakeholders, a minority of employers, who thought that universities had a role to play in construction, in building Europe. A minority of rectors, but when I say a minority, it was a tiny minority who had to do their lobbying, their advocacy, to be activists for their cause, for the common space. With European motivation, it's interesting to become a citizen of Europe. It's motivating. And with the motivation of saving higher education systems, because in several of the countries, if the higher education systems had not been reformed, they could have been in danger. This is why people didn't trust in this. They were not aware of this. But this need for reform in the face of globalization to maintain open access higher education systems corresponding to the socioeconomic and technological development levels that are required for global competitiveness. This required reforming our higher education and research systems. So the first stakeholders were the universities. leaders of institutions, and those who believe in these values. I think this is fundamental data. It doesn't matter whether it's for 5 or 10 years. I feel that I'm very happy because at the end of my career, I've experienced a very interesting thing in Europe, which may never finish, ever. I'm going from the 1980s. The Bologna process has a different name, but it's always continuing. But I'm sure that harmonization is not finished yet. This is also valid in other contexts. So, if there's any lesson, it's to have a converging activity for university stakeholders until they persuade the other stakeholders. Thank you.